Edmund Briscoe, Henry Ford FRS Hon. FRCPE was a British ecological geneticist. He was a leader among those British biologists who investigated the role of natural selection in nature. As a schoolboy, Ford became interested in Lepidoptera, the group of insects which includes butterflies and moths. He went on to study the genetics of natural populations, and invented the field of ecological genetics. Ford was awarded the Royal Society's Darwin Medal in 1954. Later, in 1968, he was awarded UNESCO's Kalinga Prize for the popularization of science. Ford was born in Pap Castle, near Cockermouth, in Cumberland, England, in 1901. He was educated at Wadham College, Oxford University, graduating in zoology in 1924. Life: Ford never married, had no children, and was considered decidedly eccentric. Non-academic information on his life is hard to come by, mostly consisting of scattered remarks made by colleagues. He campaigned strenuously against the admission of female fellows to All Souls College. Miriam Rothschild, an outstanding zoologist, was one of the few women with whom Ford was on good terms. Rothschild and Ford campaigned for the legalization of male homosexuality in Britain. Ford was on good terms with Theodosius Dobzhansky, who did groundbreaking work on ecological genetics with Drosophila species. They exchanged letters and visits. Ford has a Royal Society biographical memoir, but there are few other sources on his life. Career: Ford's career was based entirely at Oxford University. A.J. Kane said he took a degree in classics before turning to zoology. Ford read zoology at Oxford, and was taught genetics by Julian Huxley. The lecturer whose interests most closely reflected mine was Julian Huxley. I owe him a great debt, especially for inspiration. Even though Huxley was only at Oxford from 1919 to 1925, he was the most powerful voice in developing the selectionist attitude there. I met Ray Lancaster through E.B. Poulton. He was already an old man, but talked to me a good deal of Charles Darwin and Pasteur, both of whom he knew. Ford was appointed university demonstrator in zoology in 1927 and lecturer at University College, Oxford, in 1933. Specializing in genetics, he was appointed University Reader in Genetics in 1939 and was the director of the Genetics Laboratory, 1952 to 1969, and Professor of Ecological Genetics 1963 to 1969. Ford was one of the first scientists to be elected a Fellow of All Souls College since the 17th century. Ford had a long working relationship with R.A. Fisher. By the time Ford had developed his formal definition of genetic polymorphism, Fisher had got accustomed to high selection values in nature. He was most impressed by the fact that polymorphism concealed powerful selective forces. Like Fisher, he continued the natural selection versus genetic drift debate with Sewell Wright, whom Ford believed put too much emphasis on genetic drift. It was as a result of Ford's work, as well as his own, that Dobzhansky changed the emphasis in the third edition of his famous text From Drift to Selection. Ford was an experimental naturalist who wanted to test evolution in nature. He virtually invented the field of research known as ecological genetics. His work on the wild populations of butterflies and moths was the first to show that the predictions made by R.A. Fisher were correct. He was the first to describe and define genetic polymorphism, and predicted that human blood group polymorphisms might be maintained in the population by providing some protection against disease. 6 years after this prediction it was found to be so, and furthermore, heterozygous advantage was decisively established by a study of Ab-X-Ab crosses. His magnum opus was Ecological Genetics, which ran to 4 editions and was widely influential. He laid much of the groundwork for subsequent studies in this field, and was invited as a consultant to help set up similar research groups in several other countries. Amongst Ford's many publications, perhaps the most popularly successful was the first book in the New Naturalist series, Butterflies. Ford also went on in 1955 to write Moths in the same series, one of only a few to have authored more than one book in the series. Ford became professor, and then emeritus professor of ecological genetics, University of Oxford. He was a Fellow of All Souls College, and Honorary Fellow of Wadham College. He was elected FRS in 1946, and awarded the Darwin Medal in 1954. Ecological genetics (EB). Ford worked for many years on genetic polymorphism. Polymorphism in natural populations is frequent. The key feature is the occurrence together of two or more discontinuous forms of a species in some kind of balance. So long as the proportions of each form is above mutation rate, then selection must be the cause. As early as 1930, Fisher had discussed a situation where, with alleles at a single locus, the heterozygote is more viable than either homozygote. That is a typical genetic mechanism for causing this type of polymorphism. The work involves a synthesis of field observations, taxonomy, and laboratory genetics. Melanism in the peppered moth. Ford was the supervisor of Bernard Kettlewell during Kettlewell's famous experiments on the evolution of melanism in the peppered moth. Biston Betullaria. The entomologist Michael Majerus discussed criticisms that had been made of Kettlewell's experimental methods in his 1998 book Melanism: Evolution in Action. This book was misrepresented in reviews, and the story was picked up by creationist campaigners. In her controversial Book of Moths and Men, Judith Hooper gave a critical account of Ford's supervision and relationship with Kettlewell, and implied that the work was fraudulent or at least incompetent. Careful studies of Kettlewell's surviving papers by Rudge and Young found Hooper's suggestion of fraud to be unjustified, and that Hooper does not provide one shred of evidence to support this serious allegation. Majerus himself described of Moths and Men as littered with errors, misrepresentations, misinterpretations and falsehoods. He concludes, if you wade through the 200-plus papers written about melanism in the peppered moth, it is difficult to come to any conclusion other than that natural selection through the agent of differential bird predation is largely responsible for the rise and fall of Carbonaria. Kettlewell and Helen Spurway, then the graduate student of J.B.S. Haldane, were known to have shocked Ford by catching live moths as they flitted around a light, popping them in their mouths, and eating them whole. Haldane, who did not like Ford, was of the opinion that Ford and Kettlewell had attempted to capitalize on the supposed evolutionary adaptation of the main two variants of the peppered moth, for which Haldane, as early as 1924, had predicted the statistical probability of rate of change from light to melanic forms as an example of classic Mendelian genetics. In 1961, Haldane and Spurway talked to Canadian lepidopterist Gary Botting about the peppered moth and the unlikelihood of Ford and Kettlewell obtaining results that approximated Haldane's 1924 statistical calculations so closely. Botting already regarded the case of the peppered moth as tantamount to belief in Lamarckian evolution, and was of the opinion that some genetic mechanism other than bird predation was at work. Bibliography: Clark B. 1995. Edmund Briscoe Ford. Biographical Memoirs of Fellows of the Royal Society of London. Creed R. 1971. Ecological Genetics and Evolution. Essays in Honour of E. B. Ford. Blackwell, Oxford. An outstanding volume. Hooper, Judith 2002. Of Moths and Men. Norton. Huxley, Julian 1954. Morphism and Evolution. Heredity 9, 1-52. Kettlewell H.B.D. 1973. The Evolution of Melanism. Oxford. Marin P. 1995. The New Naturalists. HarperCollins. London. Wainwright R.I. and Ackery P.R. 1984. The Biology of Butterflies. Symposia of the Royal Entomological Society of London, No. 11. Works by Ford. 4dB. Mendelism and Evolution. Methuen, London. Carpenter, G.D. Hale and E.B. Ford. Mimicry. Methuen, London. 4dB. The Study of Heredity. Butterworth, London. 2nd edn. Oxford University Press. 4dB. Polymorphism and Taxonomy. In Huxley J. The New Systematics. Oxford. 4dB. Genetics for Medical Students, Chapman and Hall, London. 4dB. Butterflies. New Naturalists, No. 1 Collins, London. 4dB. British Butterflies. Penguin Books, London. 4dB. Moths. New Naturalist, No. 30 HarperCollins, London. 4dB. Ecological Genetics. Chapman and Hall, London. 4dB. Genetic Polymorphism. All Souls Studies, Faber and Faber, London. 4dB. Genetics and Adaptation. Institute of Biology Studies, Edward Arnold, London. 4dB. Understanding Genetics. Faber and Faber, London. 4dB. Some Recollections Pertaining to the Evolutionary Synthesis. In Meyer E. and Pravina W.B. The Evolutionary Synthesis. Perspectives on the Unification of Biology. Harvard 1980-1998. Effectively, this is an intellectual autobiography. 4dB. Taking Genetics into the Countryside. Weidenfeld and Nicholson, London. 4dB. And J.S. Hayward. Church Treasures of the Oxford District. Alan Sutton, Gloucester.